for joining.
Sure, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, curious, first of all, this is a medium that I love. I've been a fan of comics for many, many years, and I'm curious about what comics allow you to do in your storytelling.
Well, yeah, I've thought about that one a lot. What is it about comics? What makes comics great? And we've been doing them now for a long time. It's not like it's a medium that is great in terms of recompense. It doesn't pay really well. It's not like movies or TV, and hasn't been. It isn't for most people.
Mhm.
But what is it about the medium itself? And I think that what it really is the thrill of creating your own world that you can walk around in. And that goes for both the artist and the reader, that when it's done really well, we can pick up that comic and it's like a dream sandwich. Like you open it up and you can bite right into it. There's a whole world of things going on in there. And if the artist did a good job with it, it's a very exciting, believable world. And you believe that that artist that created it knows that world. And that's what we love, I think. And it works like film in that same respect. It's just that with comics, what's really exciting is the fact that one person did it, in at
Mhm.
least in a lot of cases. That's the kind of comics that I always like. That's what I grew up with, and that's what really really attracts me to them.
Mhm.
That feeling of a separate creative world that is that artist's own. So yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Love that dream sandwich phrase. That's cool. Yeah.
You got these covers here, and then the meat is all those pages that are on the inside there. And if it's a good sandwich, it tastes great, and you want another sandwich by that same artist again as soon as possible. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. No, a lot of times your work goes into personal reflection. And so I'm curious about that process and what that's like for you.
Let me just move this kitty.
Zoom pets are more than welcome.
Uh, Personal reflection. Yeah, I know you mentioned that in one of your questions. What's it what's it like to do really personal work and reflect on it that way? Is that the
Mhm,
question?
mhm. Drawing on your own story, I guess is the way to say it.
Okay. Um, I find that actually to be the most exciting way to draw comics of any of the comics I've done. You mentioned these other books like Snake Eyes, and I had some solo books like Avenue D. And these comics were um, sort of anthologies, either an anthology of my own work or books that I edited that included other people. And the thing about those comics, and this goes back to the 90s really, is like you were trying to get a story going and, a funny story with a joke ending or something like that, over the course of, say, 1 to 6 or 8 or 10 pages.
Mhm.
And you were doing that in this really bite-sized way. Here we go with the sandwich metaphor again. But
I love it. I love it.
you're doing something like that in a way that is as to the point as possible. And brevity was always the key. Now, with the graphic novel, I find that the stories that I really want to tell, and obviously a graphic novel is not really about brevity, though it still has to do with a book that's as well edited as possible. You don't want it to be bloated, but a graphic novel really allows for very personal storytelling.
Mhm.
And that's one reason why I'm sure that the artists have gravitated towards that. It might not be something that would be perfect for, I don't know, sci-fi or something like that. It might not be as good for stories that are deeply personal, um, as for stories that are deeply personal. That's what I'm trying to say. So that, like, if I'm doing stories about myself and personal experiences I've had, I can really go deep in terms of my own character. It might be my own childhood, things that have happened since my childhood, and I can really express them in much greater depth than I ever possibly could in a regular comic. Regular
Mhm.
comic, you really are having to chop things down and go for that brevity. And you can really expand with a graphic novel. So those are the things I think about in terms of being personally reflective. I really like knowing what people's real experiences are, and I
Mhm.
really enjoy getting into that authenticity of the vulnerability of that person if it's real. That's very
Yeah.
important to me. I don't want to be bullshitted. I definitely don't want to see heroism in comics. That's also a personal thing. I don't like that at all for the most part.
Mhm.
The world of comics history and its fixation on heroism is something I kind of loathe because I think it's bullshit usually. And I think that heroism exists, but there's a really high price for it, really high cost for heroism. It's not a guy in a cape saving the day. So there's been so much of that kind of thing in the world of comics that it really runs contrary to human behavior. And human behavior is what you can do with a graphic novel. There's been much more of that, probably beginning with Justin Green, who did this book about growing up with the Catholic Church, Catholicism.
Mhm.
Did that in the early 70s, and then followed by um, Harvey Pekar, and the world of human behavior then started to make its way. It was making its way much more into the world of comics by that point. You know, how people really are, what sexuality is really like, all these things that had been kept under started to boil to the surface. So,
Yeah, I'm thinking about that introductory quote of if you read an autobiography and there's not something shocking or not something
right.
slightly negative, you're probably not reading something true.
Yeah, that's a George Orwell quote. Autobiography is only to be trusted when it
Mhm.
reveals something disgraceful. And
Yeah.
it's not necessarily that we want to see people at their lowest or at their worst in autobiography, but we do want to trust that we're getting something unvarnished, something more real, something that, you know, we believe. We really, I think, really want that with autobiography. And we're
Mhm.
generally not going to be getting that if somebody is just trying to make himself look good. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
True enough. True enough. I was going to ask the next question was what comics allow you to do creatively? It sounds like there's a certain amount of space that it allows for you to explore and
well,
dig
yeah,
into a topic.
yeah. You can really do that. I mean, I think the other reason for the allure of comics that really exists, especially with a graphic novel, is that probably a lot of people who have done graphic novels over the past 20 years or so might actually have been interested in filmmaking. And the attraction of the graphic novel is that what it allows, which every filmmaker would want, is Final Cut. But Final Cut only really matters if you have got everything worked out, meaning you have to be fairly accomplished as a cartoonist. You know, you have to be able to write well and draw well and do all the separate things that are required, like lettering and inking and everything else, and making the whole thing add up as a complete package. But I do believe that that's probably been a real attraction to people because you do, as I say, get to make your own movies on paper, you know.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Where do you think comics will be headed in the next 10, 20 years?
It's a good question. I was just thinking about that before. I mean, if the world is still around in the next 20 years, and I hope it is, comics have gone through these different phases. You know, they were a very cheap pulp thing as the comic book went, and we've seen them go all the way from there to something kind of literary, you know,
Mhm. Mhm.
and we kind of wonder if that's where things have to go, if that's where they have to stay, or if they're going to go back to uh, the pamphlet. I just don't know. You know, I wonder about all these things that I grew up with, whether it's rock and roll or um, movies, because we've seen things shift over the years. And the thing about rock and roll is it may be essentially analog, and so there may not be a need for that kind of rebellion. It's interesting that comics seem to be pretty healthy to me
Mm.
right now. They seem like a medium that people really care about, really love. And it was thought that they were going to maybe go the way of, the web comic, and that's how people were going to be taking them. But it now doesn't seem like that's been the case.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems like people want to hold a comic and flip through it and get to, see that page. They want that page layout to be held within their hand as opposed to on a Kindle or whatever.
You can definitely relate to that. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
When you're working creatively, do you start with the word, the image, or does it kind of go back and forth for you?
Um, Often enough, I will do a great deal of thumbnails of the characters that are going to be in it. That might be the very beginning. But what really gets it going, the essence of it, is writing out as much as I possibly can that I know about the story as I can. So, um, the book I'm working on now, for instance, is about a summer I was hospitalized for an altercation I had with some policemen in New Jersey. And getting locked up and what that was like, and finding a way into that, I needed to do a great deal of writing to figure out what the structure was going to be.
Mhm.
For me, I consider myself a writer who draws, so I have to have everything together as a narrative really before I do any penciling on a comic book page, if I know what's good for me. Sometimes I don't, because everybody loves to draw, that is cartoonists. And so you'd rather be drawing than writing, I think, as a cartoonist. And that's a natural tendency. You see these great splash panels as a kid, you see these comics, beautiful drawing. That's what you want to be doing. Um, but if I know what's good for me, I spend a lot of time writing, because the best comics I ever grew up with and read really had that. They weren't just great art. So I guess that's the process. It takes me a lot of time to find the story I want to tell, and then uh, find a way into it and write it and put it all together so that I can then draw it and make it happen.
Sounds like you are engaged in a new project, which is exciting to hear about it. I'm sure you're on the creative journey that way. Any particular places where people can go to learn more, to see more about your work, to support?
Well, I'm on Instagram, and I have a bunch of pages from both my last books, Chicago and Chartwell Manor, in there, and lots of sketchbook pages, some paintings, color work, things like that I've done. And yeah, I post there regularly, so that would be the most obvious place. I've got a website, but I haven't been dealing with it in a while. It seems like that isn't really that necessary, maybe. I don't know. And my work has been reviewed on Goodreads and Amazon and all that. So if anybody needs to look up Chartwell Manor or Chicago, they can find out about them that way too.
Anything that we've missed in the talk through that you want to make sure to share before we close it?
Um, let's see. Offhand, I can't think of it. We've pretty much covered it. I'm very much into the new book that I'm doing about this summer I was locked up. I feel like it goes places that my other stuff hasn't gone. I think it pushes the graphic novel into places it hasn't gone, into really looking at what sanity is like, what's insanity is like,
Mhm.
and capturing that in a way that is very coherent. So that's the one I'm really into. It's called Asylum, and yeah, so.
Looking forward to seeing what you're doing there and how you're capturing that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Well, Glenn, I promised you a brief talk, and I think we've accomplished that. But I greatly enjoy the work and glad to share about it. And as people that are watching the video, they'll see images of the book covers come up between us and things like that. I'll add that in after. So glad to talk with you anytime, and maybe we can talk again when Asylum is closer to being finished.
Thanks. Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. Thank you so much.